Today we have with us Yashica Reddy. She's investment director in Schroders for climate change and energy transition strategies. Thank you, Yashica, for being with us today.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here.
I think the first question is almost mandatory. Which are the main differences between a climate change solution and an energy transition strategy? How does each of them bring to the table, or are they both sides of the same coin?
Pankaj, this is a really relevant and topical question because all of our clients are thinking about decarbonization solutions. A climate change equity portfolio is very much like a global equity portfolio and encompasses within it clean energy or the energy transition. The energy transition, on the other hand, is much more niche. It's focused on sustainable energy and sustainable energy alone, and it focuses on just a few subsectors. So the difference is quite big and they can be complementary, but it is important for investors to understand what it is that they want and what it is that they're getting. A climate change equity portfolio can provide broad-based equity exposure across subsectors, across sub-industries, whereas the energy transition is primarily focused on the decarbonization of the energy mix.
Okay, so energy transition is underrepresented in the global equity indices. And on the other hand, the alternative energy indices are mainly concentrated in renewable energies. So what is the strategy in Schroders focus for this main theme?
People who are looking to get exposure to the energy transition by just investing in a broad-based equity index will not, because the overall exposure to the energy index, to the energy transition companies through a broad-based index is something around 2 to 3%. Whereas if you look at the passive space and you look at the Global Alternative Energy Index, for example, most of that exposure, as you rightly said, is to renewable energy equipment and renewable energy generation. What you're not getting is exposure to things like hydrogen or batteries or energy storage. What we do at Schroders is invest across the entire energy transition value chain. And the way that we do that is first by identifying 3 structural drivers that are key to enabling this energy transition to take place, enabling companies to basically generate those returns and deliver on those returns. The first is the decarbonization of power generation. And that's essentially replacing electricity that is currently generated by fossil fuels with electricity from renewables. And that has to go from 20% today to about 85 to 90% by 2050. So companies that will benefit from that are companies that are building out their renewable infrastructure, but also companies that are part of the broader ecosystem. Those are companies that we look at within the Schroders Global Energy Transition Strategy. The second structural driver is the electrification of energy use, and this is very important, and this is underappreciated in the passive space. And the reason I say it's underappreciated is because you can have 100% renewables, but the electricity that renewables produce only account for 20% of the electricity we consume. The reason being most of the energy that we consume is from gas that we're using to heat our homes, but also from the fuel that we put in our car. If we all start electrifying our car fleets and we start buying EVs and driving about 8,000 miles or 10,000 miles in it every year, we would end up using the same amount of electricity as a household for 4 people. So you're going to see massive growth in this space as well. Last but not least, increased efficiency of consumption. Very, very important. We need to learn to mitigate energy loss. If you take the US as an example, from where energy is produced to where you end up consuming that energy, there is a 20 to 25 percentage point energy loss. And so we need more efficient components and subcomponents, we need substations, we need microgrids, and all of those areas will see massive growth over the next 10, 20, 30 years. So we take a value chain approach to investing in the theme, which sort of diversifies that risk. We try to mitigate drawdown by managing those risks, and you'll see that with our trailing volatility, but we also invest across the entire energy transition value chain, providing that diversified, balanced exposure.
Okay, thank you. And in terms of valuation, are you finding more opportunities in this year? Is this easy for you, or where are you finding those opportunities in the portfolio?
Although you know very well the challenges that have faced this sector and equity markets in general this year, 2021 was very challenging for the energy transition space after a very remarkable 2020. And the reason it was challenging is because we saw a material increase to raw material costs, whether that be steel, nickel, copper, you name it, gone up quite materially. These are all very important components to manufacture the equipment required for the energy transition. Equally, we saw a substantial increase in natural gas and electricity prices, and we also saw a massive increase in freight costs. It's not just the freight costs that increased, but just the ability to get hold of the ships to then transport the goods from one point to another was very, very difficult. So these were the number of challenges that the energy transition space had to deal with in 2021. But what has happened over the course of last year and this year is that valuations have reset once again. And this has been good because we're starting to see a lot more upside across a number of sectors and subsectors. And what we've been doing is sort of been layering into that weakness. I do think it is best to sort of buy into companies or layer into companies on depressed returns rather than on their peak. So for people who are thinking that they missed the energy transition back in 2020, I think valuations have reset. I think there will be short-term challenges and headwinds, and we can certainly talk about that. But the long-term opportunity is very, very clear, and we've never been more excited in the theme. This is a multi-decade, 30-year structural shift in the way that we produce, distribute and consume energy.
And maybe inflation and the political agenda are two of the main headwind risks for this year, without ignoring the pandemic and also the Ukrainian conflict. But how do you see this can influence in the portfolio, these two things?
As I was mentioning earlier, we've seen a lot of supply chain disruption, which has led to inflationary pressures. And if we continue to see a deterioration and increase in real rates, it will continue to put a strain on equity markets more generally, and this space will not be immune. In terms of delays in policy implementation, we've certainly seen some of that, especially in the US, with the Build Back Better being delayed by a few more months. But I think what is clear is that while there is uncertainty at the moment, and it has created some delays in terms of projects, the longer term visibility and directionality of those policies are still very clear and very strong. So if people are looking for returns next quarter or the quarter after that, they might be slightly disappointed because the outlook for 2022 is certainly not peachy. But what I will say is that this is a multi-decade investment theme, as I mentioned. It's not a 5-minute, 10-minute, 1-year investment theme. So for people interested in the long-term growth trajectory of many of these companies and who are investing for the long term, I think they will be very pleased that the fundamentals are very much intact.
So Yashica, thank you very much for your time or your explanations. It has been very useful for us to know in-depth strategy.
Thank you so much for your time.